Hi, I'm Dr. James R. Doty, MD, a professor at Stanford University and a researcher in the area of compassion. Please listen to this podcast as we discuss how your company can go to the next level by incorporating compassion and empathy.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Leadership Loyalty Tips for Executives. Let me ask you, what do you need to do to up-level your leadership? Well, in a time of global pandemic, many of us find ourselves a little short-tempered and maybe even a little irritated. Could there be a genuine business and strategic advantage to discovering how to become more compassionate? Well, stay tuned, because that's where we're going to go on today's show. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I am the Dragonist, and I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. To find out more about me, you can simply go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. This episode of Leadership and Loyalty is brought to you in part by Curiosity Bites. Yes, that's our other podcast. Curiosity Bites is the answer to the questions, how can we bring people together who completely disagree? This is exactly what your heart and soul and mind have been craving. It's your chance to sit in on some real and often intense conversations with some of the world's most interesting people, including astronauts, philosophers, holy people, quantum physicists, skeptics, entrepreneurs, Grammy award-winning entertainers, even some folks you might completely disagree with who you'll find truly fascinating. And there's a particular guy on there. He's a neuroscientist, a neurosurgeon. I think you'll find him very, very interesting. In fact, I'll tell you more about him in a minute. You can simply go over to dovbaron.com and you can sink your teeth into another episode of Curiosity Bites. And as always, you can find us anywhere that you listen to podcasts by simply going to Apple Podcasts or Spotify, where it is, and searching for the Leadership and Loyalty podcast. As always, we need your help in staying relevant, so please get over there, rate, review, and subscribe to the show. If you're a regular listener, big thank you to for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners, and we're honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. All right, let's strip it down and dive right in. Over the last 15 or 20 years, there's been a lot of talk about the need for EQ in leadership. And although that's true, many leaders have read the books, they've even taken some of the trainings, yet many of them still lack genuine empathy and compassion. Many leaders, particularly of the older generation, might not really see the value of exploring these things. But the question remains the same. Does ignoring EQ, and more specifically empathy and compassion, impact your leadership and your profitability? And if it does, then we have to ask, can compassion positively impact business? Well, stay tuned, because that's exactly where we're going today, because my guest on this episode is Stanford neurosurgeon, neuroscientist, compassion researcher, New York Times bestselling author, entrepreneur, philanthropist, and those are all the terms that have been used to describe Dr. James Doty. He is also known throughout the world for promoting the value and proposition of compassion. He is a good friend to many spiritual and religious leaders, most notably the Dalai Lama. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me welcome friend of this show and of Curiosity Bites, Dr. James Doty! Always good to have you, Nick.
Great being with you again, and happy to have another conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. So here's where I'd like to start. You have traveled the world, you've gotten to know some of the most amazing leaders in the world. But the world is in an interesting place, and sort of diagnostically, what do you see as what do you honestly see as the state of leadership today?
Well, I think one of the challenges and one of the problems is, in some sense, what we would call unrestrained capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
There is a notion that those who create the wealth, which are the working class, somehow should not share the wealth. And as a result, and you look all over the world, not just the United States,
Mm-hmm.
you see the leadership of companies and the shareholders vastly profiting. And then you see people who are the workers who are not. And you
Mm-hmm.
simply look throughout the United States and you have a huge number of individuals who either do not see a possibility for a future in their employment, or more recently, because of COVID, there have been huge cutbacks. And the sad thing is that when people are not given the opportunity to make an honest living, or what we would call a living wage versus a minimum wage, this ultimately leads to despair, oftentimes a sense of hopelessness. And as a result, this impacts not only the worker, it impacts his family, his
Mm-hmm.
children, and the whole environment around him. And it's very sad, because the reality is that when you have an individual working for you and you create an environment where that person feels valued, that they're not a cog in a wheel,
Mm-hmm.
where you respect their dignity, you appreciate their expertise in the job that they do, you honor that by paying them a living wage, then frankly, everything changes in your company. There are numerous examples now that demonstrate that when an individual CEO makes a commitment to, if you will, compassion, which is the recognition of another suffering with a motivational desire to alleviate that suffering, it has a huge impact. There's increased productivity, there's
Mm-hmm.
increased creativity, and at the end of the day, there's increase in shareholder value and a much more profitable company.
So that's interesting, isn't it? Because as you started out there, I can hear the minds turning of those who are very pro-capitalist and feeling like, oh, here we go with another socialist rhetoric, you know. But what you've discovered and what you've researched and found is, in fact, that compassion and applying compassion to your workforce and to the people who work with you and for you is that actually profitability goes up, right?
No question about that at all.
Right. And so is that the fundamental argument we need to have come across with people who seem to think that paying a quote livable wage is a socialist rhetoric? I mean, I was seeing a thing the other day, and it was saying, do you think that there was a questionnaire from some leadership group, and it was saying, do you think that it's good for us to raise minimum working wage? And I was shocked and surprised at how many people said no. I mean, it just was beyond me. I didn't understand it. Um, my only understanding of that is from, because you and I talked about this in the other show, we grew up poor. We understand what it was like to be poor. And so my only understanding of when somebody says no is that they couldn't possibly have walked in those shoes. And I think that one of the great lessons for all of us is nothing's real until it's real for you.
Well, I think actually there are two paths someone can take who come from a challenging or background or a background of poverty.
Mm-hmm.
One is they can remember the pain they went through and how much they suffered.
Sure.
And as a result, they make a commitment in their life to not put anyone in that position, to be fair, to be equitable, to recognize human dignity. Then there's another subset of people who come from a similar background, and their attitude is the complete opposite. The attitude being, hey, no one was nice to me. I made it on my own. No one reached out to help me. So why do I need to help anyone else? And I think that is part of the problem. And then the other part of the problem is those from, you may call it elite backgrounds or affluent backgrounds, and they have no understanding of the poor
Right.
and what it takes to survive. As an example, a minimum wage job, which in the United States is $7.25, I believe. Imagine if you have that job and you can't afford a car, you can't afford insurance, so you have to take a bus.
Yep.
So then the bus is an hour or two to your job, an hour or two back. Both parents are working because you can't afford to pay rent otherwise. Well, how can you have a child? How can you care for a child? How can you give them anything other than the minimal subsistence to survive? And it's not possible. And then what happens is you have crumbling of the nuclear family. You have this chronic despair and concern about feeding your family or paying your rent. And as a result, this negative emotional state that is created as a result of this also has a huge impact on health.
Yes.
And so there's huge consequence to this type of an attitude. And it's interesting because there's also a perception among the affluent that somehow people who are poor deserve to be poor. They didn't work hard enough. They didn't take the opportunities. They really don't deserve it because they're really not that smart. And I've never met a poor person who likes being poor, at least in my limited experience. Now, that's not to say they want to be rich. They just want to live a decent life. And again, the reality is when you see CEOs of these companies literally making hundreds of millions of dollars and other senior executives making similar amounts while they're promoting not paying a fair or living wage, frankly, it's disgusting. And in fact, if you look at the reality that 50% of the world's wealth, I think, is held by 12 people, and I may have that statistic somewhat wrong, but it's not much different. How is this even possible? The other aspect is that what happens with the affluent is that they have access to information that the average person doesn't have. I'm talking even middle class people don't have that information.
Yes, that's true.
This is why you see extraordinarily wealthy people increase their wealth by 10, 15, 20, 30% per year or more. While for an average person, if they make 3 to 5% on their money each year, they're thankful. And again, it's not a fair playing field. It's as if you ask people to compete in a 100-yard dash. And while the poor, minorities, the neglected are at the 0-yard line, you have, as you gain influence and connections, these people start at the 80, 90, 95 yard line. And then they get across, they say, hey, I made it. What's wrong with these other people? And they don't understand how poverty, insecurity affects someone's ability to succeed. And I think that's fundamentally one of the problems that we have, not only in this country, but I think around the world for many people.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because, as you say, it's a global issue, and we're seeing more of it. And sort of on a political leadership level, one of the things that I'm seeing is, of course, that we know this. It's not my opinion; it's a fact. There's the rise of the strongman leader throughout the world. We're seeing it with Bolsonaro in Brazil. We're seeing it in the United States. We've seen it, in Hungary. We saw it recently in Cyprus, Philippines. It's all over, and that strong man personality type is the type who is the quote leader of the revolution. And the leader of the revolution is always the person who appears, keyword, who appears to be listening to the disenfranchised, to be listening to those whose voices are not heard, who are in fact the workers. I mean, whether we look at the Russian Revolution or we look at anything that was, and some of it was quite terrible, but it was led because leaders who had power didn't listen. And so somebody stepped in and said, I'll listen to you guys and we'll go and take this over. And it's, I mean, it's a recipe for disaster, not listening to, as you said, working class individuals and even middle class these days. It's not listening to them. It's disastrous.
No, I think you're exactly right. And the problem, of course, is that, first of all, if you feel, and in our case, either party failed you or failed you multiple times, then you're ripe to be influenced by these types of strongmen.
Of course.
Because when you're fearful, when you're angry, then individuals who have the proper oratory will create a narrative that makes you want to believe it. And it's based on complete lies over and over again. And as a result, people get immune to the truth. And they want to hear these lies while the person may be saying, I'm providing food everywhere. I'm doing this. I'm doing that. Your lives are better. Well, the reality is they look around, their life is no better whatsoever. And those individuals almost universally become the absolute most corrupt individuals leading a country over and over and over again. This is history repeating itself. And fortunately, you look at Belarus and you look at Poland and a few of these other countries, the working class has rebelled and is fighting against that.
Yes.
But it's tough because this is a manifestation of not caring. This is a manifestation of the social contract between governments and the populace has been broken. And it's amazing where people will say, we need less government. We don't need all these rules. That confines the corporate entities from being successful. Well, you simply look as an example at the tax break in our country, which was to the most affluent, the most successful companies. What percentage of that went to the workers? I think less than 6%.
Yep.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And it did nothing for job creation. In fact, what happened is it went into the pockets of the very people it was supposed to not go into.
Yep.
And this is a repeating narrative. You know, the wealthy class also has the ability to hire the best tax attorneys, to hire the best corporate attorneys, and to, again, manipulate the system in their favor. And I am not a socialist per se. What I do believe in is social democracy. And what that is a contract between those who work and the populace of a country, that the country will ensure that they're cared for at a minimal level. That includes a living wage. That includes social services to help them. That includes a daycare for while they're working, et cetera, et cetera. And it's these things. And if you look at some of the most successful countries, every one of them has incorporated these types of practices, and the country has not gone bankrupt.
No.
It's interesting. There's a quote by Tolstoy that says, there's a man on your back choking you, and he fully acknowledges this reality, but at no time does he ever offer to get off your back and stop choking you. And in some ways, that's the nature of the people who are controlling the major corporations, the financial markets. In fact, if you look at Davos as an example, here's a group of people who feel that they have the insight and the right to determine your future, and that the future should be played out as they wish it to be played out. Well, many of those people are analogous to the guy on your back choking you. Yes, they will do reforms, recommend certain actions that will appease the situation, but at no time does this ever impact what they are trying to do, their own safety, their own wealth in any way. And that's the problem with Davos and some of these other groups who decide that they know the answer to the problem. What they need to do, of course, is they need to get intelligent people who are well educated beyond the corporate premise of ruthless capitalism to give insights and self-awareness into how to create a better world for everyone. The reality is that the difference between somebody having $1 billion and $100 million, frankly, in terms of how you lead your life, is irrelevant, except for the fact that once you get $1 billion, then you start buying ridiculous things. You have 2 or 3 planes, you have a yacht, you have 5 houses, and you can only live in one of these at a time. And I was walking through New York City recently, and a friend of mine, it was evening, he was pointing to all these lights out in some of the major residences, expensive residences. And what he was saying is that something like 70 to 80% of them have absentee owners who never show up. They're just sitting there empty. And this is all throughout the country, where people feel compelled to buy a 5, a 10, a 15, $20 million home that sits empty, when we have individuals who are desperately in need of being cared for, who are making minimum wage, who have families, and whose lives are being destroyed by this type of an agenda.
It's fascinating because, yeah, I live in a city that has a lot of that, homes that are sit empty for 8, 9, 10 months a year. And at the same time, particularly in America, which, for me is, as we talked about it before, I fell in love with America as a kid, and in the belief of the American dream. And I found it fascinating that, Americans are very much about patriotism, and, and they send vets off, the military off, and they come back as vets. And these vets are homeless on the street. And I'm like, yeah, you went to war as a working class, most often as a working class individual, to get a better life. You served in the military, you served your country, you come back and you're kind of discarded. And actually who you were fighting for, if your truth be known, was not your country, but was in fact contractors and companies and organizations who will never see the war. So it's the whole thing is upside down in many levels. But I wanted to bring it back to a piece with you because, we can talk about all this, and I don't want this to be a socialist conversation that people think is a socialist conversation, because it's not. But you're a neuroscientist, you're a neurosurgeon, you've been a very successful entrepreneur, you've made a lot of money, you've lost a lot of money, you've donated a lot of money. And I want people to understand that this is not just some guy spouting off. This is so first of all, at a neurological level, neuroscience level, when people are living in that kind of poverty and that kind of fear, their brains don't work right. Is that correct?
Well, absolutely, because what happens is that as humans, the ideal situation that we're made for, where our physiology works its best, is if we feel safe.
Yep.
And that's when you kick in what's called your parasympathetic nervous system, which is part of your autonomic nervous system. And this is called oftentimes the rest and digest system.
Yep.
This gives access to your executive control function area. This gives access to memories, experiences, other options, and it allows for you to make discerning, thoughtful decisions, while oftentimes, if you're in the fear mode, this stimulates the sympathetic nervous system. And this is associated with what we call the flight, fight, or freeze response. And what this does is this actually cuts off your connection to your executive control function, because you're in survival mode. Every day is survival mode for you. You never know what's going to happen next to you. You have no control over your environment. And as a result, you're terrified, and because you never know what's going to happen next to you. Right. As an example, imagine in the United States that for an emergency or something that were happen to a family, they only have $400 of available savings for any type of an emergency may happen to them. I mean, that's fundamentally nothing. And it's terrifying. Imagine you're praying that your child doesn't get sick and you have to take him to the emergency room. You're praying that your husband doesn't get laid off from work. It is a devastating tragedy. And these are not, again, this is not socialism.
No.
This is common humanity. And this is about actually caring and sharing part of the pie that these people worked for and frankly deserve.
Again, for me, what's fascinating here is what you just said, is that, your brain doesn't work right if you're in fight, flight, fear, any kind of fear mode. The prefrontal cortex doesn't get the blood flow, all those things. Your brain is flooded with cortisol, the stress hormone. You can't think right. And so to make this ridiculous statement of, well, people are not pulling themselves up by the bootstraps. Well, when you can't eat, or you're afraid that you won't be able to eat, or you want to have somewhere to live, it's pretty hard to think in a collaborative, expensive way when you're just trying to make sure you don't die of cold in the winter. So this is something that's really important. And then on top of that, what you said, which is, again, something I remind a lot of the leaders I work with, is it's not, you can look at it as socialism or you can look at it as humanity. And I personally think there's a great deal of difference. One is handing out something to people who don't want to do anything for it. I know there are those people, I get that, but there are, in my experience, because I have worked with extremely wealthy people, there are at least equal number of extremely wealthy people who want money for doing nothing. So I don't know that it's limited to the poor.
No, unfortunately, though, many of the wealthy people who are in that position, that happens to them.
Yeah.
They have, again, the connections, the resources to either
The
game the
stipend.
system or take advantage of a particular situation. And
Mhm.
again, I just want to emphasize, in no way is this a discussion of socialism.
No.
This is a discussion of either social democracy principles or principles of our common humanity, our obligation to the other. The vast majority of people, frankly, want to work. They want to take care of their families. They want to be productive. They want to be useful citizens in society. Yes, there's probably a small percentage of people who are drug addicts, and in fact, maybe because of their a situation of being poor.
Yeah.
But that number is so small compared to the reality that the vast majority of people simply want to have an honest job that pays them a living wage and that can give them the ability to afford the essentials so that they can live a reasonable life. It's interesting, probably 30 or 40 years ago, the minimum wage was actually enough to live on, even with
Yes.
one person working. They could rent a home, they could care for their children, they could occasionally go out to dinner, et cetera, et cetera. And that doesn't exist anymore. And it's horribly, horribly sad. And you just look at around you, so many people who are suffering. I just saw a photograph yesterday, and it showed literally thousands and thousands of people lined up to receive food at a food bank in Texas. And how is this even possible? You have one of the most prosperous
Mhm.
countries in the world, and we have this huge swath of people who are barely making it. And this impacts children, it impacts relationships, all of these things. And the problem is, though, a lot of the wealthy class live in a bubble.
Mhm.
They'll listen to these programs that tell them that they're cheaters. They'll listen to these programs that say that they're people who don't want to work and are taking advantage. And of course, unfortunately, the politicians play on this. In the Reagan years, it was the welfare mother, which of course was the dog whistle for Black multiple children, different fathers, right?
Yeah.
And this was just made up. And yes, there are situations like that, but that's not the sole aspect or the real description of what many of these people suffer from.
No.
And then when you have government institutions who very specifically uh, chose, in this instance, to create structural barriers to the poor, to minorities, then that creates a whole another level. And this is a huge, huge problem. And it's one, unless it is addressed, it is going to lead to continued chaos. And all of these people who have so much wealth are going to be paying the price. And I hate to say that, but at some point, people will get tired. And at some point, you will find an individual who has the oratorical ability to inflame these people, but it's not going to be to play along with their agenda. It's going to be to destroy everything around them because in their mind, they have nothing, so everyone should have nothing.
Yep.
That is a real fear, I'm afraid.
Yeah, it's and I've said that I believe that in 2020 we have seen that we are on the brink of a civil revolution that very possibly could become extremely violent if we don't listen, but we're not very good at listening. Now, I want to go to this because I think this is an important piece here. Is in understanding you and where you're coming from, because I mentioned that you grew up poor, but there's a whole story here, and we'll touch on it in a moment of how you raised up. But you did become an entrepreneur. You did very, very well during the dot-com boom. You became very successful, and then you lost it all. I would like for you to tell us a little bit about that story, and so that people can understand, because it's a lot of where you're coming from and what you're proposing that will allow people to sort of go, okay, this is not some high horse guy. This is a very human individual. And I have the pleasure of, I've gotten to know you a little bit, and we've had some pretty deep and in-depth conversations about where we both came from on Curiosity Bites. But just to give people an understanding of that climb in the boom and it all goes away, and then what happened?
Well, so first, let me explain a little bit about my background. Neither of
Thank
my
you.
parents had gone to college. My father, unfortunately, was an alcoholic. My mother had had a stroke when I was a child, was paralyzed, unfortunately, chronically depressed, attempted suicide. We had been evicted from various residences because of inability to pay rent. Um, so, I'm very familiar with poverty and the consequences thereof. Now, sadly, unlike myself, many people who grow up in those environments suffer as a result. When you grow up in that environment, there's something called adverse childhood experiences, which you can just add up the numbers, and a number is given for living in poverty, a number is given for a family member, a parent who's a drug or alcohol abuser, another's given for mental health issues, et cetera. And children, once they reach a certain number, their future in some ways is almost predetermined, and it's a bleak future. I was fortunate in that I met someone who gave me a set of tools that allowed me to change my life, and more importantly, changed how I viewed the world, because I had a lot of anger and hostility. And when you have anger and hostility, this plays itself out in your interaction with others.
Of course.
And to make a long story short, I ended up being able to go to medical school and becoming a neurosurgeon. And you mentioned the military. I also spent 9 years on active duty in the military. But I did become a successful entrepreneur to the point where at the peak of the dot-com, I had about $78 million. And I also had stock in a company that was probably going to be worth $50 to $100 million. And what happened is when the dot-com crashed, and remember, I was living in a penthouse, I had Ferraris, Porsches, et cetera, et cetera. First of all, I had all of that and I was not happy. I would get one thing and I would say, okay, now I'm happy. I did this, I accomplished this, I have this much money. Okay, now I'm going to be happy. Then I wouldn't be happy. Then I'd buy a Ferrari and go, God, this is going to make me happy. Nothing
and it would
made
for
me
5
happy.
minutes.
Yes, exactly. And what happened is I ended up, like many in the dot-com situation, losing everything to the point where I was actually bankrupt, about $3 million in the hole, because based on my stock price, I was able to get a loan, and I got a $15 million loan. And this paid for a lot of stuff. And when it crashed, of course, the bank came to me and I had to sell everything. And then
You're at zero.
Zero, minus zero, minus 3 million.
Minus 3 million. I want everybody to get that.
Yes. And then this put me through a great period of reflection as to sort of my purpose, meaning in life. Why wasn't I happy acquiring all of these things that I thought would make me happy or feel important? And I realized that I was trying to impress others because of my own shame and insecurity.
Mhm.
And that's why I kept doing all of this stuff and acquiring all of this stuff. And in this period of reflection after I lost everything, I realized that, and I went back and I went over all these lessons this woman had taught me, actually in this magic shop. That's the name of my book, which you mentioned, Into the Magic Shop. And I went over those and I realized the most important part was not being of service to others. And what I mean by that is that while I was a doctor and I was successful and I was always generally kind, it wasn't about that, though. It was still about me getting what I needed to make me feel important or to make me feel fulfilled. And after that period of reflection, I thought about that. And then I was in a situation where I had ended up giving a lot of stock in a company that had yet to go public to charity. And as I was going over my personal situation with my attorneys, they informed me that they had actually forgotten to file the paperwork. And in fact, I didn't have to give any of my money away. And ultimately, this turned out to be about $30 million. And I thought about this a long time, and I actually went ahead and gave that away in the face of being $3 million in the hole. And in some ways, it was a cleansing experience. And in the other ways, it took the monkey off my back, in that I understood that my importance comes from inside of me and my feeling about myself, and not any external praise. And I think that's a part of the problem for so many people, is that they need this external praise to make them feel full, to feel that emptiness that all of us have inside. And what they confuse, because so many poor people, so many people admire people with money and power, they confuse this false admiration, if you will, with actually having meaning for them. And I think that when you sit down and examine it, though, you realize that could be nothing further from the truth. The only way we can feel truly meaningful, the only way, I tell people there's a quote that says, you know that you met your purpose when, after you die, your children, when they think of charity, compassion, and kindness, they think of you.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
And that, I think, is ultimately what each of us wants at the end of the day, to be to somebody, to be an example of caring, kindness, love, compassion, and not be perceived as a person who was just in it for themselves and did everything they could to acquire wealth. And again, like I tell you, we know that when you're kind, you're compassionate, you watch out for others, which I think is fundamentally your responsibility as a CEO, is when you do that authentically with meaning, then everything works better. Your company is more prosperous. Your employees are more creative. They're more productive. And at the end of the day, the shareholder value will be dramatically increased.
Yes. I want to make sure that everybody understands this, because what James has just shared there was that, he had all this money, the fancy cars, the fancy houses, all those kinds of things. The dot-com becomes the dot bomb. He loses everything, becomes 3 million in the hole, but still holds about $30 million worth of stock that he had offered parts of to charitable institutions that had never gotten filed. But even in that moment of being 3 million in the hole, chose to do it anyway. And you, from what you were saying there, that comes from the lessons you learned from Ruth from in the magic shop. So I know you touched on that you had grown up in poverty. Your dad was an alcoholic. Your mom and dad had a stroke. But what was it that made you go into the magic shop? And what was it made you listen? Because oftentimes, we've all had a bit of good advice and gone, yeah, that's good. Bye.
Well, and
why did that kid listen?
Frankly, I've been in that situation myself. In this particular situation, what I would do when there was turmoil at my home is I would oftentimes get on my bicycle and pedal as fast as I could, oftentimes with no particular destination. And one time I ended up at what we call a strip mall in the United States, with a number of shops. And one of those shops was a magic shop. And I had an interest in magic. And I went into this magic shop because of that. And the owner was not there, but his mother was there. And she knew nothing about magic in the store. But what she did for me was something, frankly, I think is incredible, in that she greeted me with a radiant smile. And what I mean by that is oftentimes when you meet somebody, they're immediately judging you, and that will impact how they interact with you.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, I didn't feel that at all. And I was a 12-year-old kid, and I probably wasn't dressed particularly well, but she treated me like I was her equal.
Mm.
And we began a conversation. And as a result, after a period of time, she said to me, I really like you. I'm here for 6 weeks, and I think I could teach you something, but you'd have to come back every day for the next 6 weeks. Now, I wish I could tell you that I had this incredible self-awareness and insight that made me know what this offer meant, but frankly, I did not whatsoever. What I did know was that this was an incredibly kind person. She created an environment which I would call creating one of psychological safety. I didn't feel threatened. I felt comfortable. And she was giving me chocolate chip cookies. And I had absolutely nothing else to do. And so those motivators were why I showed up every day. But that interaction with her really changed the trajectory of my life. I had a great deal of anger, hopelessness, shame, insecurity. And over the period of time with me, she taught me a mindfulness practice. And remember, at that period of time, mindfulness, neuroplasticity were not terms that were talked about by anybody.
No.
And so she taught me a mindfulness practice, the first part of which was a body survey and a breathing exercise. And what that amazingly does is once you become relaxed, because a person who comes from this type of chaotic environment is always stressed and anxious, it actually shifts you from your sympathetic nervous system to your parasympathetic nervous system. You can relax by breathing slowly in and releasing it. And then next, she taught me that the negativity or the negative dialogue in my head that said I wasn't good enough, I wasn't smart enough, actually was not a true narrative, and that it was it was within my power to change that narrative. And I did so. So from one of being hypercritical, one of being negative, I changed it to one of self-affirmation, of self-love, of being gentle with myself. And that then allowed me, if you will, to be self-compassionate And then that allowed me to look at the world through a different perspective. And that perspective was through the lens of compassion. What I didn't realize that when I was hypercritical, when I was ruminating over my own issues, I could not see the world clearly. And as a result, I had very negative opinions about people. I felt that everyone was against me. And once I was able to look at the world a different way, I realized that on some level, everyone is suffering. That oftentimes when people interact with you, the interaction isn't even about you. It's about something in their head or some event that has occurred to them. And they are reacting to that and not really reacting to you. And it made me change in some ways how I reacted to people. There's something that is attributed to Viktor Frankl, but I've never been able to find the quote. But the statement is, between stimulus and response is a pause, and within that pause lies your freedom.
Yes.
And what I mean by that is that typically when we are presented with an option, especially by somebody aggressive, especially in an unknown situation, we shift into our sympathetic nervous system mode because of our fear of the unknown, if you will.
Yep.
When you pause and you take more time, like as an example, count to 6 seconds, then what happens is you actually are more attuned to what they're really saying, more understanding. You can see things clearly, and then make a more discerning, thoughtful decision, which is a manifestation of your prefrontal cortex, or this executive control area, actually giving you the information you need to make a much, much better, thoughtful decision.
So I want to stay with this for a minute, because you talked about this internal language that was self-deprecating and certainly not self-supportive. And this lady in the magic store had taught you to be mindful, and you changed that language pattern to be more self-supportive, more kind, more compassionate. And at this point in time, I would guess that there are many leaders who are listening here. You and I talked about this on Curiosity Bites. Many people who are going through a sense of feeling like they're a fraud, and so they're listening right now. They're going, "Yeah, this sounds really great. I've tried that, but I can't get that voice to shut up. I can't get that voice to change and go from critical to compassionate, to go, from derogatory to supportive." What would you say to that person who has tried breathing, has tried meditation, has tried positive affirmations, and find themselves very quickly getting caught in that self-deprecating and even self-loathing that then ends up spilling out onto others?
Well, that's a very challenging situation. I mean, even for myself, after years of experience, I still have a tendency to start heading in the direction of negativity or being hypercritical, and I stop myself and I tell myself that's not true, and then I reaffirm positive things that I have done or that have happened to me based on reality, not a perceived insecurity. And I think that's very important. I think for many people, meditation can be a wonderful thing.
Absolutely.
There's a subset of people who have a very challenging time doing that, but simply relaxing and breathing without the term meditation and being more thoughtful is equally as powerful. In some ways, you're doing the same thing.
Yeah.
I think that's one. There's also an actually interesting area of research that looks at what we call a dyadic meditation. And in fact, I'm an advisor to a company called Pure App, I think is the, and interestingly, what they do is that there's a conversation that a person has with another. And the first part of the conversation is the person asks you a series of questions that you answer truthfully about your own concerns, your own fears, etc. And after you do so, they simply thank you for that. And they go through this series, and then the other person does it back to you. And what's amazing about that is that oftentimes with meditation, the retention rate actually can be quite low. It can be less than 10%. With dyadic type interaction with somebody, because the nature of that interaction is one is where you're authentic, you're exposed, but you're relying on the other person to be truthful and honest. This has something over 90% retention rate. And it's very, very powerful for a number of people. It's something that I do as well. But I think that type of a practice is also very helpful. And I think in some ways, you can't change unless you have some knowledge. And while everyone is aware of the imposter syndrome, I think the reality that you can change, and people have a tendency to want change to be immediate, and that's not how it works. In fact, in my own meditative practice, when I first started, I couldn't do it at all. And it was very frustrating. I would get angry. But then what I noticed is the period of time I could sit there and be in this mode would slowly increase. But it took weeks and weeks. And in some ways, it's like exercising. You know, I have a tendency sometimes to go, okay, I'm going to get into shape. And I try to do the hardest thing possible. And immediately I fail. I go, this is BS. I'm not going to do it anymore. It's too hard. And the reality is I haven't given it the chance to have its effect. And it's a subtle effect at first. And if you give it time, though, and look at when you started to look at when another point in time, you'll realize there's been a significant change. As an example, I operated on a lady who saw me, and literally she was in a wheelchair. She couldn't get out. She was in horrible pain, and this was related to a back problem. And she was literally crying on high-dose narcotics. And I ended up operating on her. She comes back and sees me 3 months later. She's walking. She's smiling. She's not on any medication. And I'm talking to her. She says, you know, doctor, you really didn't help me at all. I go, what are you talking about? She goes, well, you know, I just don't think you did a whole lot. And her daughter looks, she goes, what are you talking about? You came in here in a wheelchair on drugs. Now you're walking and you're not taking any drugs. And she thinks about it. She goes, you know, I guess you're really right about that. And it's hard when incremental changes happen for you to appreciate them. You know, it's great if it goes from black to white, but unfortunately, it typically goes through varying shades of dark gray to lighter gray, and ultimately
that is an incredibly important piece. As part of my work with the people I work with privately, one-on-one, they say, you know, what will be the outcome? And I say the outcome will be dramatic, but it will be dramatic at the end. It'll be incremental all the way through, to such a degree that halfway through you'll look back and you'll go, nothing's really changed. And I said, and I will be able to see that things have dramatically changed, but your ego, it's just how the ego works. Your ego doesn't like change because it sees safety in the things that are the same. So it says, no, nothing's really changed. The fact that you lost 50 pounds, no, you didn't lose 50 pounds because I'm the same weight as I was yesterday. Yeah, but we're going to look a bit further back than that. And that's part of the challenge is we don't do that. And I don't think that human beings, until we start developing ourselves, are very good at understanding consequential thinking. We don't consequentially think forward or backward. And that's why we repeat history and we do stupid shit because we just keep doing this stuff over and over. And you've done some pretty fascinating work. And I want to make sure we get this in before we come towards the end of the show, because you're showing the neuroeconomic models of altruism and how that plays together. Because, you know, neuro, brain, economics, money, and then altruism, how does that tie together for the people listening so they can grasp this? Because I thought it's fascinating.
Sure. Well, it's interesting because a number of studies, we've done some and others, have demonstrated actually that if you are put into a scenario where you're given money and are forced to give it away versus choosing to give it away, it has the same effect in increasing metabolism to your reward centers in your brain. Now, so let me
Whether
say
you're
that again.
forced or whether you choose.
Yes, yes.
The reward center has the same payoff.
Yes, exactly.
Wow.
And there's an interesting study that was done, which essentially had to do with student aid, and this was with college students. And there was a certain scenario about who deserved the money. And in fact, the students were brought in with the idea that they were going to receive some money as part of a benefits program. And the twist to it was that they laid out all the people there, and they made it actually that this person ended up not actually qualifying.
Mm.
And so he had to pass the money on to someone else. And again, even in a situation where it was potentially detrimental, they still had a huge uptake in metabolism of their pleasure and reward center. And this is almost universally the case if people will actually give it a try. When you reach out, when you do something for another, it has a huge impact on the other. And I wish people would more commonly do this. Again, dealing with a lot of individuals like yourself, I mean, in the sense that we do the same thing sometimes. You talk to some of these individuals who are quite affluent, and they'll give you all the reasons they can't donate money to X, Y, or Z, when in fact it would be very easy for them to do it. And they create this narrative in their head that of scarcity, not abundance. And they end up punishing themselves by, again, buying extraneous stuff that means nothing, when in fact, if they just took a portion of that, then they could really benefit another person. You know, one of the things I used to do, and I'm not in the same situation anymore, but when I would buy a Ferrari or Porsche or do one of these things that I felt was excessive, I would give a similar amount to a charity. So that it was like carbon credits.
Right.
I guess compassion credits.
Yeah, exactly.
Because yes, I was doing something that I enjoyed, but I would also do something that hopefully would help other people. And I think that if you take these types of ideas where you're, again, always questioning, always thinking about how you can, again, be that person who you want your children to think of as kind, compassionate, and caring. If you always come from that mindset, how do I want my children to perceive me as a human being? You will almost always make the right decision.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Now anybody who's looking over your shoulder can see the Dalai Lama, and I know that you've done work with the Dalai Lama, and you've sat down with many great spiritual leaders in the world. You are obviously a very successful man in what it is you do as a neurosurgeon. You're at Stanford. You're a neuro researcher. Like I said, successful entrepreneur. All those things, looking at all those things, they are what we societally perceive as success. What is success to you? How would you help us to grasp what you really understand success to be now?
Well, I do appreciate that in many people's mind, these accomplishments are a definition of success in modern society. And they are. And I've worked very hard and I'm proud of those accomplishments. But at the end of the day, none of it means anything. And what I mean by that is that, you know, in academic environments like the corporate world, it can be very ruthless. And, many people, unfortunately, claw their way to the top. They'll step on someone's back as they walk over them and do all sorts of things. And I, fortunately, have never done that, nor would I ever think of doing that. But it's a reality. I tell people, though, that what centers me is putting myself in the perspective of the other person. And this is oftentimes hard for people to do. If you interact with another person and you think about, let's say they ask you for a raise, or they come to you with a problem, or they have a need, sure, it's easy to dismiss somebody. You have a lot of things on your mind, you're busy. But if you can put yourself in that person's position and look the world through their eyes, you're much more likely to be thoughtful, kind, and caring. It's interesting, you mentioned these various and sundry spiritual and religious leaders. Having been around a number of them, including the Dalai Lama, Desmond Tutu, Eckhart Tolle, Amma, the Hugging Saint, and others, there are a lot of people who hang around them, and some of them are ego-driven. They want to be close to the power, if you will.
Yeah, halo effect.
Exactly. And they'll do all of these actions to attain that. But the reality is the people who these individuals, these elevated spiritual beings, actually connect with, and one of the reasons that I have been very, very fortunate to get close to them is because, one, I have no agenda. Two, I'm not asking for anything. And three, I understand that these individuals can look at a person and in a microsecond determine their motives. And it's not about the dogma. They can look at an individual and tell whether they love, whether they care, whether they're compassionate. And those, beyond any religious dogma, are the keys to, one, being a fulfilled human being, and two, living a life of meaning and purpose. And yes, I appreciate that this is a program about leadership, but a great leader is an example for others to follow. And to be a great leader, unless you incorporate empathy, compassion, kindness, you're not a great leader. You're a mediocre person striving to be something they're not truly. And it's only when you sit down and think about this that your eyes will open. There's a very interesting story of a fellow by the name of Gordon Carnes, who I think was in Australia, and he ran Woolworths there. And he came and he was sharing the fact that he asked a company to do a 360 review of his employees and of himself. Mm-hmm. And at the end of it, they came to him and they say, I have to tell you, essentially on every measure, your company is in the lowest quadrant. And in of our 15 years of doing this, no one has scored lower than you at a CEO level. And he was a very hard driving CEO. Mm-hmm. And he went home and he shared this with his wife because he was actually going to fire these people because, quote unquote, they don't know what they're talking about. He went home.
They don't agree with me. So clearly they don't know what they're talking about.
There you have it. So he went home to his wife and he explained this to her. He said, can you imagine? They said I was the worst. And I had all these attributes that intimidated people, made them fearful, da, 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 da. She goes, what do you think of that? And she said, well, they're right. And he looked at me and said, what do you mean they're right? And she said, I've been trying to tell you this for 20 years.
Sure.
And what happened is he went on a journey of self-discovery and ended up gaining self-awareness and insight and realized that the driver of every decision was fear. Fear about being judged, fear about not having the best company, fear that people were not performing. And he changed his entire mindset to incorporate empathy, compassion, thoughtfulness into what he did. And within 2 years, he had another 360 review. And they now were at the highest level of employee engagement, productivity, creativity, shareholder value. And again, he's not the only example. There are innumerable examples about this. But it takes some degree of self-awareness. It takes the ability to be with yourself and understand your own deficiencies, and having an openness to improving yourself.
Yeah.
And until you're truly authentic about that, things will not change.
What a great place for us to finish. What a great place for you to land that message so well, for people to understand, and for leaders particularly to understand the value and depth of compassion in leadership and in business. James, it has been an honor and a pleasure, sir. Always a joy to talk to you. Please tell our listeners and our viewers where they can find out more about you, about your book, and about any of the resources that are available.
Sure. You can find out a bit more about me at jamesrdotymd.com. That's jamesrdotymd.com. Or the book is called Into the Magic Shop, A Neurosurgeon's Quest to Discover the Mysteries of the Brain and the Secrets of the Heart. And if you go to intothemagicshop.com, you can buy the book and learn a little bit more about my own personal journey. And of course, the center that I run at Stanford, which does research in this area, is called the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, which is part of the School of Medicine at Stanford. And you can find that at ccare.stanford.edu.
Fabulous. And again, we'll make sure that all those things are shared in the notes, in the show notes. And again, I want to remind you that if you want to really take a deep dive with James and I, you can go there to Curiosity Bites, and we really dive into some really powerful backstory and understanding of where James came from, and his whole philosophy on empathy, and his relationships and his interactions with these wonderful leaders. It's a truly fascinating series, totally binge-worthy on Curiosity Bites. You can find out more about it at dovbarron.com. And remember, you can also hang out with other conscious leaders and chat about this episode that you've been listening to, or any past episodes, by going into either our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just look for the Leadership and Loyalty Podcast. Truth of the matter is, it doesn't matter how successful you are. If your employees and your customers don't understand what gives your company meaning, you're only working at a fraction of your true capability. To find out more about you can hire me, Dov Barron, as a speaker, a leadership strategist, or executive advisor for yourself or your organization. Simply go to dovbarron.com. That's dovbarron.com. Because unified meaning, or as we call it, finding your dragonfire, is the one single monolithic difference between greatness and mediocrity in individuals and in companies. I want to thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. Till next time, stay curious, my friend. Stay curious about how you can be just a little more empathetic, a little more compassionate, how you can look at the world through a different set of lenses than the ones you're looking at. I'm Dov Barron. I'm here to assist you tapping into your dragonfire to reach that next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business, your life, and your leadership impact. And I am out.